I spoke at the Oxford Union, this is not name dropping, earlier this year. And the thing that I found most shocking was we're in the presence of Prime Minister after Prime Minister, their busts lining the wall. A debating society which is founded in the early 19th century deliberately to mimic Parliament, to train people for it. And we had these, dare I say it, awful speeches in which even the responder to a motion read. The complete failure to be able to pick up a word and to respond to it. But the thing that was frightening was the motion rejected the great man theory of history. They all believed we were little people, little tiny people at the mercy of great forces. We had Mr. Ken Follett, that great authority on history, telling us that medieval cathedrals weren't designed, they just happened. This, of course, is the most absolute nonsense you can think of. And his speech culminated in this extraordinary moment in which he said, human life is like riding a great wave. You don't make the wave. I'm afraid this is now the spirit of the staircase, that wonderful French phrase, l'esprit de l'escalier. I did not point out that somebody who had sold even more books than Mr. Follett once also compared human life to riding a wave, that Shakespeare has that extraordinary image that there is a tide in the affairs of men. Yes, there is the tide. The trick is to capture it, to ride it, to shape it, to dominate. And I believe that is possible. And I think the reason that we are facing our current national catastrophe, which I think we are facing, is that we've lost that confidence. Once upon a time, not very long ago, you were talking, Sir, my Lord, in your introduction of a Nelson, of a Churchill. They consciously made history. They took that wave, and in the case of Nelson, literally rode it. In the case of Churchill, they rode the wave of war, and they turned it to their advantage. What I want to do, I want first to begin then by taking this idea of greatness, which seems to me to be something is inescapable and important and matters. If we look at the figures who are now challenging the West, if we look at, I never know how you pronounce Z, there's so many consonants that need to be spat out that I can never get round it. If you look at him, if you look at Modi, if you look at Putin, they are all convinced of greatness. They're all convinced that they can shape the historical narrative and do something with it. Now, this can lead to disaster. A Hitler thought this too. It is by no means a guarantee. But it seems to me that if you have, and we're here, you referred to the echoes of history that surround us. We are unworthy, I think, I accept you, my Lord, the heirs of an astonishing historical culture, which has shaped for the last 500 years the world we're in, and effectively invented modernity. I would like to suggest it fundamentally goes back to the early 16th century and to a certain chap called Henry VIII. I want to put Henry at the absolute heart of our history. If you think about it, Henry VIII stands literally in the middle of our history. From the Norman conquest 1,000 years ago to now, he's there in the middle. Now you can take that middling position and look at it in very different ways. Somebody who is also very great. Actually, the one area we're prepared to talk about greatness is pop singers. You know, or top, YouTube stars or something. We are prepared to use or misuse the word for that. But if you actually look at somebody who was a pop star of the 19th century, Charles Dickens, a great novelist, he has this wonderful and very dismissive phrase on Henry VIII, whom he describes as a spot of blood and grease on the history of England. Think about it. Henry is a kind of axis around which English history turns. So you need lubrication, and blood and grease come in extremely useful in this process of lubrication. Because the world before Henry and the world after Henry is completely different. And it's that difference, why, how, and the consequences of it, that I want to address. But it's also a difference in Henry. Again, one of the things that's very striking, this idea of greatness. The idea of greatness, where does it come from? Well, it's one of the dominant features of the ancient world, of the Greco-Roman world. And Alexander the Great, many of you will remember, India is fashionable at the moment. When he'd conquered India, he wept because there were no more worlds to conquer. This man from a little corner of Greece, Macedonia, sweeps across the whole of the Eurasian landmass and conquers it. Similarly, the great emperors of Rome, a Caesar, a Trajan, a Hadrian, these rulers of an entire known world consciously had a notion of greatness. And Shakespeare, of course, reflects this completely, and he reflects it, ladies and gentlemen, in the most interesting way. As I often do, he laughs. You referred to my dry sense of humor. He laughs at it. One of my great achievements as a young man was to play Malvolio in Twelfth Night, and I did it incredibly well, because I didn't know I was having the piss taken out of me. So my youthful pomposity was brilliantly exploited. And there's, of course, this extraordinary speech, well, not speech, the letter that the wicked maid Maria sends Malvolio and sends him into a ecstasy of cross-gartered stockings and, cross-gartered legs and yellow stocking, which I'm not wearing, I promise, but there we are. But the letter is, some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. The 16th century is obsessed with the idea of greatness. Most of Shakespeare's plays are studies of this, both getting there, failing to get there, the terrible things people will do to do it, the consequences, the destructiveness, the achievement, whatever. And this seems to me to be absolutely embedded in the culture. And the work that I've done, some of my new work on Henry VIII, because there's always things to discover, which will be appearing in a collection of essays, which is edited by Ian Dale, another sort of media personality on monarchs. My essay in that begins with a very, I think, unusual way of looking at a king. It asks who educated him and what the nature of his education was. And what we know about Henry VIII, I mean, Henry's very interesting. He is the first king who receives what we would regard as a proper education. I'm a grammar school boy. Henry VIII, isn't it obvious, terrible creeps. What does Eton calls us oiks, doesn't it? Anyway, we're very, very successful oiks, and we normally deal with old Etonians in a flick of a wrist, but there we are. But the grammar school boy is essentially the creation of the late 15th, early 16th century. And there are two great figures that shape the ideas which governed our whole educational pattern until the 1970s. One of them was the great Dutch scholar Erasmus, the notion of Latin and Greek as training you, essentially in Erasmus's case, at communicating the truth of Christianity. And then the other figure that we spend much too little time talking about is the great Italian who is responsible for the I think, frankly, much more influential on most people than Erasmus, which is Baldassare Castiglione, the Book of the Courtier. And the Book of the Courtier It does it, and both of them, interestingly, both Erasmus and Baldassare Castiglione, they look back to that world of Rome. Remember, our culture is very peculiar. It's a consciously retrospective culture. We were talking about the Great Hall with your mock mock classical pilasters, the bits of wood enclosed in plaster and whatever. We are a culture that consciously looks back to the civilization that fell before we began, the civilization of Greece, and particularly the civilization of Rome, and the particular culture, that notion of rhetoric, or what I'm doing now. You observe I'm speaking without notes. The ability to address a large audience simply out of what is in your head, to move them, to persuade them, to hold them. That is the center of ancient education. That is what the whole pattern was, the reading, the study of grammar, the study of language, the study of history. It was designed to inculcate in you the capacity to do that, because these were oral cultures in which effectively politics was run from the marketplace, the forum, and you had to be able to talk. You'd to be able to drive it through. And the two of them, Castiglione and Erasmus, pick up this idea and they run with it. And what's astonishing, and we need to get this into our heads to get a sense of Henry, Henry meets both of them. These two key figures. He meets both of them at his father's court within 2 years of each other when he's a boy of 9 and 10. Astonishing. And they both recognize in him somebody who had the capacity to do what they wanted. What's the difference between them? Erasmus is essentially, I think, a fantasist. Erasmus has got an awful lot in common with Woke. He believes in peace. He believes in the world that we're in is fundamentally wicked, and a bit like King Charles, that there's a better world lying around somewhere or another. And I'm sure nowadays it'd been terribly ecological as well, but we'll leave him aside. Much more important is Castiglione, who wants to combine this persuasiveness on the one hand with something else, the traditional quality of a gentleman. And this is the thing that governed the whole shaping of our governing class from that point to the immediate period of Churchill and the post-war, which is you're a scholar and a gentleman. You, on the one hand, you have your capacity to do all these things that I'm talking about in terms of rhetoric, but you can also do what a wimp like me could never do. You can do all the physical exercises as well. You've got to be as good with the sword as you are with the word. And the people who have dominated our culture, the Churchills, the Nelsons, and whatever, they've been able to do both. What I want to suggest is Henry is one of the first examples of this. He is somebody consciously trained in this. He is the first king of England to be taught the new Latin of Erasmus. He's the first king of England. Also, again, this is something we've forgotten, consciously we tend to think of his father, Henry VII, as being pacifist and all the rest of it, absolute nonsense. He's deliberately trained in the arts of jousting as well. After Castiglione had visited England and said, this is the new fashionable Italian idea. So Henry then is up there in terms of the ideals, the educational ideals of the late 15th, early 16th century. But Henry is something else. Henry is also what I was trying to get over, this extraordinary doubleness, the physical qualities. We were talking over drinks about his size. He's, as far as we can tell, he's about 6'1". He's hugely broad and strong, which means he's a natural jouster. What is jousting? It's rugby on horseback, with the avowed intention of doing damage to your opponent, rather than pretending that it's not sporting. So it's kind of All Blacks rugby. It really is like that. He is, at the same time, brilliantly intelligent. He's the first king since Henry II who is fully fluent in Latin. He is bilingual in French. He is just less than professional as a composer and as a performer in music. He is a serious poet. And when he comes to the throne, somebody who is not a fool, okay, he might die a martyr. Thomas More says he is the most impressive king who's ever sat on the throne of England. He's got the quality. So what does Henry begin by doing? And this again is where I've sort of tried to set this up. Here is somebody of enormous promise, sort of Tony Blair on steroids, you know. And we all say, but you've all got to remember things begin well and can turn out badly. There is the terrible problem as a historian, you have hindsight. Often you must try to suspend hindsight. You must try to see where it begins, even though you know where it ends. There is nothing worse than a history written retrospectively. That's a disaster. So Henry then begins with this profound impression. And by the way, I haven't added something else. He's a romantic. He believes in romantic love. I've been able to establish that one of the very peculiar things about him is that he's brought up by women. He's a second son. So he has a completely, in this case, not public school. He's not sent off with other men and whatever to be knocked into shape from the age of 7. He's brought up with women until his early teens. Completely, and he needs and depends on them. And that extraordinary poem that he writes in the summer of 1510, his great pop song, Pastime with Good Company, is the line, I loved where I did marry. That's Catherine of Aragon. Henry is a serial romantic. He always loves his wives. The trouble is, he's a bit like, I'm told, the classic drunk, who never empties a glass without lining another one up first. And there's a certain element of that, I'm afraid, with wives. Right. So Henry then, this person of staggering promise, he comes to the throne, and this is the clincher, explicitly talking about greatness. And he does so directly to Erasmus through his great mentor, Lord Mountjoy. And Mountjoy writes to Erasmus, our king isn't interested, like his father, in gold and silver and jewels. What he wants is virtue, glory, immortality. Greatness. How does he go about getting it? But what I think we need to understand, and this is the real theme of my talk this evening, is Henry's reign turns on a pin's head. You see two different kings trying to achieve two different forms of greatness, which point you're looking. Now, the assumption, or rather the argument, that Henry changes radically during his reign is now a commonplace. Many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with the theory that the reason, we all know that the young Henry is rather a nice chap. And we all know that the old Henry is not a nice chap. And in fact, maybe the most monstrous creature ever to have sat on the English throne. I mean, if you look at the extraordinary Quentin Matsis engraving of Henry as an old man, I've said it's a kind of lunar landscape, this face of horror. With these eyes and this tiny little mouth punctured into this lunar landscape. We know Henry changes. The question is why the old Henry is so different from the new Henry. And of course, as I think we're all aware, in the COVID and post-COVID world, we have a terrible tendency to medicalize everything. Let's get one thing out of the way quickly. Henry does not have venereal disease. We know this absolutely certainly because we have not his medical record, but we have his drugs record for the last 6 months of his life, and he has not administered mercury. And by this point, mercury is the standard treatment for venereal disease. And if you don't believe me, go and look at the Mary Rose, where even the sailors and soldiers on board the Mary Rose, there is the barber surgeon's instrument chest there. And every time I've shown a chap the thing in question, this because it is a syringe with this vicious beak for the urethral application of mercury, and there is still mercury inside the thing. And by the way, it does work, providing it doesn't kill you first. It's a kind of well, a bit like modern medical chemotherapy in some ways is very similar. You apply one of these terrifying poisons to the body, and it's a kind of race between does it kill the disease or does it kill you or badly affect you. Anyway, so Henry does not have that. On the other hand, the other argument is that in 1536, Henry suffers very bad concussion in a jousting accident, and this is the thing that turns Henry from a nice chap into a nasty one. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a very easy problem with this. It's called dates. The fundamental thing you have to understand in history is chronology, when things happen. If you don't understand chronology, you can't do it. So here we have this argument that Henry turns from a nice person into a nasty person in 1536. I'm sure many of you can tell me what the problem with this argument is. A year earlier, he commits the two most outrageous executions of his reign to Thomas More and St. John Fisher. In other words, before he's had the blow to the head, he still turned horrid. So what turns him horrid? Well, I apologize because this may tread on many toes here. It's called a bad divorce. Henry's divorce is like the effect of the divorce of Edward VIII. It is completely against the mores of the time. Edward VIII had to abandon the throne. He had to abdicate. Henry, with his astonishing force, his courage, his drive, carries it out. So the change then is 1527, and it's meeting Anne Boleyn. Before that, what is Henry's quest for greatness? It is utterly conventional. Henry thought he was going to be another Henry V. He thought he was going to conquer France. He thought he was going to be the king who finally concluded the 100 Years' War. And we know this precisely in the Book of the Garter, the Black Book of the Garter, which Henry replaced, Henry VIII replaces all the medieval records of the Garter with a new Garter book. In it, there are realistic portraits of every previous sovereign back to Edward III, apart from Henry V. Now, we all know what Henry V looked like. He looked like Laurence Olivier. He has a pudding basin haircut and long, lean, pale face. Not in the Black Book of the Garter. And he's got a ginger beard and ginger hair and looks rather like Prince Harry on an off day. And it's the young Henry VIII. In other words, Henry is consciously seeing himself as the man who will reconquer France. The other thing that my recent researchers have done is to show that his father, Henry VII, actually restructures the whole of royal finance to enable him to do so. And again, we've not, I think, got anything like the proper picture that what Henry VII does. Henry VII begins his reign with amicable relations with France. We're trying to normalize relations with trading. The English claim to France for an enormous, they called it, the French call it a pension, the English call it tribute, and at the same time allowing his great councillors to be bribed as well. But it worked too well. The French under Louis XII were able to consolidate the monarchy in France, and they were able to start enormous conquests in Italy, in both Milan in the north and Naples in the south. And Henry VII realizes that he is actually creating this superpower on the other side of the Channel, which is something the English never want to do. And so what he does, he looks around for an alternative. And he finds these glimmers in the House of Habsburg. At this point, the claims of the House of Habsburg just hang by a thread. You've got Maximilian, the King of the Romans, who would, yes, one daughter was married to Spain, another daughter was married in England, you just about inherited the Netherlands and whatever. And the person who really creates the success of this extraordinary achievement of the Habsburgs in the first 25 years of the 16th century, which turns them into the masters of all Western Europe apart from France and the New World, is England. It is Henry VII. Henry VII, in the last 4 years of his reign, when he's getting these vast amounts of money from Empson and Dudley that I'm sure we've all heard about, 60% of it goes straight in cash to the pockets of the Habsburgs. It is staggering. The gross royal revenue is about £110,000 a year. In 1505, in April 1505, £108,000 in cash, in silver pennies, is sent to the Netherlands. The sums are gigantic. You actually deplete the silver supplies of England and the currency supplies of England to do it. But what you do is you create the Habsburgs as a rival and counterweight to France. And unfortunately, you do it too well. And they then sweep the board. So Henry, in this first period of his reign, there's the invasion of France, there is a success against Scotland and so on. It looks for a brief moment in 1513 as though he'll pull it off. He doesn't. England's resources are too small. First, the French hit back, and then there's this gigantic shift with the House of Habsburg. What is it that then sends Henry Henry, in other words, if Henry had died in 1527, nobody would remember him. He would be a failed late medieval king who tried to revive the 100 Years' War. What is it? Why are we all interested in him? Why are you here? We're interested because a simple accident, an accident of love. I've already pointed out that Henry is a romantic. He falls out of love with Catherine, poor woman. She'd had 10 pregnancies, like Victoria. She was short and pretty when she was young, and short and very fat and ugly in early middle age. Henry loses interest in her, and he falls for the charms of this extraordinary woman, Anne Boleyn, whom he should never have fallen for. The 16th century was a bit like now, the kind of people that your colleagues fall for in the House of Commons and have to resign afterwards. Pneumatic blondes of a certain degree of attraction. And Anne Boleyn wasn't in the least like that. Anne Boleyn was dark, swarthy, black eyes, and entirely unpretty by 16th century standards. She was just very, very sexy and extraordinary. This trained ability which he'd acquired in France to manipulate men, and she sweeps Henry off his feet. And Henry unfortunately finds himself in this terrible position. One of the things that he'd done in that first half of his reign is not only present himself as the conqueror of France, he presented himself as a papal knight. He'd actually fought his first war, bizarrely, in 1513, for the Pope. The reason that you're actually able to swing the English aristocracy, which had got so used to being paid vast pensions by the French, is because the Pope declares that he's been oppressed by the French. And Henry bizarrely fights his first French war against Louis XII. Listen to it, because Louis XII was a schismatic and had rejected the Pope, and because he got divorced. And then, of course, he does something else. When Luther appears, Henry uses his training in scholarship. Wolsey had also developed his understanding of theology. He uses his training in scholarship, not simply again, it's his business of arms and letters, what we're talking about with Castiglione. He's protected the Pope by fighting for him in that first French war, but he also fights with words. That he fights by writing the Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, the assertion of the seven sacraments, against Luther. He's the only monarch to do so, and he gets the title, which King Charles still agitates about, Defender of the Faith, for it. So he's done all of that. So Henry, when it comes to getting rid of Catherine, thinks he's going to be easy. He's done all these favours to the Pope. And then, of course, he discovers, unfortunately, father's foreign policy has delivered Italy to Catherine's nephew, to the Habsburgs. And you didn't get the divorce. And at which point you have with profound reluctance, profound hesitation, you've to stand everything on its head. And the thing we need to understand about Henry is this man who'd begun with these high ambitions, this sense of dedication, all the kinds of noises that King Charles has made at the beginning of his reign. He suddenly finds himself having to hate what he'd loved and love what he'd hated. And the whole world steps through a looking glass. So Henry's reign then changes because of the love of Anne Boleyn, because of his determination to marry her, because of the fact that his foreign policy had delivered Italy and the Pope to Catherine of Aragon's family, and he's got to break it, and he's got to break it in a way that was unthinkable by declaring himself head of the church. And it's at this moment, doing that in order to marry Anne Boleyn, that's the moment at which Henry realizes that he's got a new form of greatness. And we know this from his own words. To commemorate the fact that and of course, Anne Boleyn falls by the wayside. She doesn't deliver the desired son. The next wife comes along and he marries Jane Seymour, who does deliver the son. And to commemorate this fact that he's got the son and that he's made himself head of the church, can we just examine what that means? Henry believes that God rewards you for doing good. He had wanted a son. He'd made himself head of the church. He had executed Anne Boleyn, and yet Jane Seymour delivers him a son, which must mean, think about it, he'd done okay. It is this extraordinary, very simple notion, even with God, you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. The attitude to medieval saints is exactly the same. If a saint doesn't do what you want, you lose interest in them. If they do, you shower gold upon them. So Henry then makes himself the head of the church. He gets his longed-for son, and to commemorate it, he has this extraordinary painting made in Whitehall, the great painting that shows, we've got half of it in the National Portrait Gallery as a cartoon, as a sketch. The other half, and the whole picture itself, disappears when Henry's great palace of Whitehall burns down at the end of the 17th century, but it shows Henry's parents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York at the back, and Henry and Jane Seymour at the front, although Jane is dead at this point. And in the middle, it's classical. There's this great classical panel of inscribed Latin verses made to look like stone. And what do the verses say? They say, "Who is the greater?" This is Frank Sinatra in Latin. Who is the greater, my father or myself? My father suppresses civil war, whilst and is great. I am greater because whilst I wielded the scepter, the power of popes was trodden underfoot and true religion was imposed in England. Henry knows that's what it is. Now, just very quickly, let's look at why it's worth taking that assertion seriously. We now don't care about religion, most of us. The king does, but very few of the rest of us do, which I think is, again, one of the impending disasters of this reign. Why does the king making himself head of the church matter so much? It's called the Church of England. What that means is you invent or reinvent English nationalism. Henry is the heart, which is why I could have given this lecture on Henry VIII as the first Brexiteer. The break with Rome is the moment at which England says it's different, that the Channel is the widest strip of water in the world. Remember, up to that point, all English wars are fought across the Channel. They're fought to unite England with France, essentially. The Channel is not a line of division in the Middle Ages, it's union. With the Reformation, you say, over there, is papist. Like I remember vividly my mother, when my first school trip, and I went to Rome, she couldn't, I'm 13, she couldn't quite say what she wanted to, but the way it went off was, Now, David, wash your hands very frequently. They have funny toilet habits. This was the point at which, across the channel, the older people here will remember they still had holes in the ground very often as loos, and it was regarded as being the ultimate horror, in the country of Thomas Crapper and all the rest of it. So there was this extraordinary line of divide. So English nationalism and all the things that we think happen under Elizabeth actually happen under Henry. You consciously invent the idea of English as a great European language. Remember, English wasn't a great European. We take this for granted that it's a world language. At the beginning of the 16th century, more people spoke Dutch than English. English is a minor North European dialect. In 1532, you publish an edition of Geoffrey Chaucer, the founding poet. Remember, English is a new language. English was only invented 200 years before Henry. It's only invented at the end of the 14th century. And suddenly at this point, you get this astonishing assertion that English is a great European language. Chaucer is the equivalent of Virgil and Homer. And you get this explosion of a new vocabulary, new dictionaries and whatever, and also new forms of literature. So all the things that we think of that go on under Elizabeth, the sonnet and the blank verse, actually happen under Henry. So you reinvent the language, you reinvent the sense of nationhood. You do something else as well. You create a new, ruling class. The ruling class of England that runs from the beginning of the 16th century to the middle of the 20th century, the landed gentry and aristocracy, is created on the ruins of the church that Henry VIII confiscates. So it's that wealth on the one hand, but it's also the educational pattern. The English ruling class, like Henry, unlike every other European ruling class, apart from the Poles who don't count because they get everything else so badly wrong, go to university. They go to Oxford and Cambridge, which had never happened before. And what do they absorb there? They absorb that doctrine of greatness. They absorb that doctrine of the idea of the service of the state, of, okay, you line your pockets with money, you don't get houses like this with nothing. But equally, there is that sense of public duty, that sense of an obligation to serve the larger interests of the state, which is why we're astonished. Churchill says this: we are better governed when the governing class is chosen from 100 families than when it's chosen from 50 million. And the evidence of 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century England is overwhelmingly on that side. And so this happens under Henry. And then the final thing is, and we need to understand this, when I was a young man, the key figure in Tudor history was my teacher, my very great teacher, Geoffrey Elton. Geoffrey Elton had this bizarre notion of a Tudor revolution in government, in which a chap called Thomas Cromwell on some moment said to Henry VIII, "You are redundant." And instead, we don't need sort of simple things like kings. We need proper committees and organizations and whatever. And I remember outraging Geoffrey by saying, at what moment did Thomas Cromwell explain this to Henry? Presumably the day before he was executed by a deliberately inexperienced executioner. And what Henry does instead, Henry doesn't diminish the royal role in government. Henry creates the role of the Secretary of State. He creates the role of the Privy Council. And the result is, by the end of Henry's reign, you've got two different views of monarchy and two different palaces that represent them. The old royal palace of Westminster, which still survives as the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The king never lives there again after a great fire burns it out at the beginning of in 1513. But there, the king is what the king is now. He is simply the representative of the way we do things. On the other hand, in Whitehall, his new palace, Henry is the real driving will. And of course, he's the real driving will that now controls people's minds as well as their bodies as supreme governor of the church. And it is, ladies and gentlemen, and we will end on this because as Lord Weems explained to me, it is the close relationships of his ancestors and Oliver Cromwell, remote descendant of Thomas Cromwell, that means that they get this rather nice house. What Henry does, he creates the tension within English politics that results in the Civil War and the extraordinary tensions of resolved in the 17th century with the Glorious Revolution. In other words, Henry is the axial King of England. He's our equivalent of Louis XIV, and in exactly the same way, Louis XIV, 100 years later, was succeeded by revolution. So was Henry, but it doesn't diminish the greatness.